This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global MedTech community at mystrategist.com.
Welcome to the latest version of the Market Pathways podcast. I'm Steve Levin, Editor-in-Chief of MedTech Strategist and Market Pathways. And we're recording this in the dog days of August. So if you're listening to this around the same time, hope you all are staying cool. And we thought for those of you who were not able to get to Dublin in April for our Dublin Innovations Summit, we would use this podcast to replay an interesting panel on reimbursement that we did at the Dublin conference. And it's funny because if we were talking not that long ago, just a few years ago, for many companies, particularly small and mid-sized companies, reimbursement really would not be high on their priority list. It was a subject that for smaller companies, they would often say, well, I'll leave that to the strategics to handle once we get acquired. But now things have changed pretty dramatically. Not only is reimbursement an issue that companies need to focus on for potential acquisitions, but it's also a topic that investors are looking to hear from CEOs, that they have a pathway to get their products paid for before a VC would even be interested in investing in that company. So reimbursement has really shot to the top of the list of challenges facing MedTech companies today. And this podcast will feature several CEOs and entrepreneurs that have been through the reimbursement wars, so to speak, and have successfully come out the other side in both traditional medical devices and digital health. And we'll hear a lot of the acronyms that often cause people's eyes to glaze over when you talk about reimbursement. We'll talk about the whole need for an expedited reimbursement pathway and the fact that the MCIT program was repealed, and we'll talk about its possible successor, which is now going by the acronym of TCET, T-C-E-T. You'll also hear some interesting stories about the urban myths surrounding reimbursement. There's a lot of talk out there that certain pathways are guaranteed routes to success, when in fact the reality is quite the opposite. And reimbursement, if nothing else, is a very individual process, and each company has to figure out what pathway works out best for itself. For example, there's some talk that national coverage decisions are always better. You'll hear on this podcast why that isn't necessarily the case. Another reimbursement urban myth is that Category 3 codes are the kiss of death. And you'll also hear why sometimes that also is not true. So with that lead in, we hope you enjoy this version of the Market Pathways podcast. And to hear this or other podcasts or get more information about our publications, we urge you to go to our website, medtechstrategist.com. Enjoy the podcast. Well, we have a fascinating panel this morning on a topic that is, I think, increasingly important. And I'd like to start by just kind of setting some context. Because when we talk about reimbursement, if we were doing this panel not that many years ago, we would never have put reimbursement on the agenda. I can't tell you, just until maybe a few years ago, you go around and talk to companies and CEOs would say, "Oh, reimbursement, I don't have to worry about that. The strategics will handle that when they acquire us." Mm-hmm.
So that's something that I don't even have to put on my list. But I think we'll hear from everybody up here, and I think the experience of everybody in the audience has been now that's quite the contrary. And it's really high on the list of issues, and frankly, I think has replaced regulatory as the number one challenge that we hear facing MedTech companies today, as things have improved with the FDA. Now, obviously, things have kind of flipped around. For those of you who were here for the MDR panel yesterday, things in Europe are obviously more challenging from a regulatory perspective, but reimbursement really has gone to the top of the list, and there's been a lot of activity, and we're going to talk about that today. Unfortunately, it can be a morass of acronyms, so we'll try to clarify things for everybody. And on the panel today, to my far right, Harry Rowland from Endotronics. In the middle, Dan Rose from LinFlow. And then on my immediate right, Josh Mackar from Stanford Biodesign. And Josh, let me start with you. Biodesign has been spoken of frequently during the course of the conference, so people, I assume, are familiar with it. But I think you, and you took over, I mean, you co-founded the program 20 years ago,
yeah.
And about a year ago, you took over with Paul Yock's retirement. And I think you implemented a notable addition to the biodesign curriculum, if you will, by adding a policy module, if you want to call it that,
yeah.
Generally, of which reimbursement is an important part. And then specifically, you launched a reimbursement study, which I want to get into a little bit. But first, I want to talk about what led you to include policy. Because it's not a logical, if you go around to the different programs, the BioInnovates and others of the world,
yeah.
Policy has not tended to be part of those programs.
Right. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Thank you all brave souls who've arrived at this early hour to be here. Yeah, the reality is we're training innovators to go out there and change the world. And yet the conditions are really rough. And most of that has to do with the policies that are impacting innovators. And so through my previous experience trying to make change and in the regulatory domain with FDA back in 2010, I learned some important lessons that there's a need for data. There's a need.
Let me set the stage for that, because first of all, you can start the clock, because I just don't want to assume people remember. Josh, and this was pre-Biodesign, right, and separate from?
Well, Biodesign existed already, but it was outside of the Biodesign.
Right, outside of Biodesign, exactly. Mm-hmm. Did a report that really focused on the challenges at FDA from a regulatory perspective, and you're too modest to say this, but I think the general consensus among industry executives in the U.S. is that this report played a significant role in the changes that we've seen take place at FDA over the past decade or so to make it more accountable, more transparent. So I just wanted to set the stage for that.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, there was a pivotal meeting. I think Mark Deem and I were in Anna Eshu's office, who is one of the leading MedTech advocates in Washington. And we were in there explaining, how the regulatory process had gotten off the rails, that the mileposts were changing, all this kind of stuff. And she basically yelled at us and said, "Look, I just got done with another person who says it's too easy, it's lax, we need to get rid of 510Ks, you got to come back here with data, because that's the only thing that I'm going to listen to right now. Just get out of here." And, we took that and said, well, I think we need to bring some data, because obviously this is not people, when it's just the domain of opinions, it's just this opinion, that opinion, this opinion, that opinion. So we did a study back at that time. I think we surveyed deeply over 200 innovative companies, and clocked their time frame through the FDA and the actual costs. We actually asked we went in detail, and this was a real credit to the community. Everyone opened up, books and shared confidential information with us that allowed us to understand the actual costs of getting these things through, and the time frames. And we also tracked FDA performance over the last several years, and it was just a line straight down in terms of approvals and clearances. And we brought that data back, and it was shocking, and initially completely rejected by FDA. But it electrified the conversation, and it amplified and strengthened the arguments that the regulatory process needed to be improved. And behind that, myself, Hansen, Mark, and Mark Leahy at MDMA and AdvaMed, and it was a community effort. It was a huge village effort, but we, advocated for change, and it happened, and that's what we're benefiting from now. And it was a good lesson that that data, clean data from a source that appears to be unbiased, can really make a difference. So that's one element of what we intend to do at Stanford.
Let me also add, for people who don't know the multiple hats that you wear, in addition to biodesign, Josh is still a venture partner with NEA and has his own incubator, ExploraMed. Talk a little bit about your experience with a couple of companies, and I'm thinking specifically of Acclarent and NeoTract.
Yeah.
And just for those who don't know, just talk a little bit about what those technologies were.
Yeah.
But from the perspective of how that also shed light on the need for regulatory
Change.
and reimbursement issues.
Acclarent was one of the first balloon sinuplasty companies, which is a treatment for chronic sinusitis, and NeoTract really pioneered a new therapy for benign prostatic hypertrophy. Both of them ran into very interesting challenges from a policy perspective. For Acclarent, it had to do with codes and reimbursement and the power that medical societies play in influencing that, and how political that whole process is, and how deeply flawed it is. And then in the NeoTract situation, the NeoTract situation is what propelled me into this whole space, because the FDA was being outrageous in the things that they were asking for. And I won't go into the details because there's not enough time, but I'll just say that it was infuriating, and it took 3 years. Over that time, the product never changed. We were just answering a series of unanswerable questions, and had already had a fair amount of experience in Europe, and that didn't matter, and they just kept on delaying us. So after that, and it wound up, it could have been devastating. Thank God for, I had great partners on the financial side. NEA was a great partner, and J&J was an investor, and we just survived it. But most companies wouldn't, and so it sort of made me realize, we got to fix this thing, and there's still many of those things right there. And the opportunity that we're building at Stanford is really to go head on and address and create a program to address all of these, develop academic research, and also train the next generation of policy makers, so that the folks sitting on the other side actually have an insight about what we're going through.
And I want to get back to the reimbursement report, but Dan, let me bring you in. Congratulations, LimFlow just raised $40 million. We're talking before about the fact that now investors are looking for some reimbursement information from companies. What was your experience as far as investors' expectations on the reimbursement front?
I think some is an understatement of what their expectations are. And it changes a little bit. Obviously, if you're raising a Series A versus Series B, I've seen this. I've been involved with LimFlow since the Series B. And every round, right, you see more and more expectation of granularity and understanding of what are you going to do next, and what is after that, and what is after that, and pretty soon you're talking about what you're going to do in 2027. And that hopefully means that you have a good idea of what you're doing between now and then, but they really want to know quite a bit. I would say out of a kind of 50 slide set, 10 slides are on reimbursement, and they take up maybe a third of the conversation.
And talk a little about, for those who aren't familiar with LimFlow's technology, just so people know what you guys are doing.
So LimFlow is focused on the treatment of end-stage peripheral artery disease. They call it chronic limb-threatening ischemia now. It used to be called CLI. Essentially, we are taking the approach, a new approach to treating these patients, essentially using arterialized blood, but putting it through a vein into the deep tissue of the foot. So we're channeling blood from the arterial side over to the venous side and using that pathway, a lot like, in fact, the easiest metaphor is, you're driving to the airport, you get stuck on the highway in traffic, you look around and Waze tells you you're going to get there tomorrow, you're not going to get to your flight, right? And you look across the median and say, well, wait a minute, that road goes to the airport. It just runs in the wrong direction, right?
And I have to say, and I didn't know this when we arranged this panel, there's a technology connection between the two of you.
That's right.
That?
So the company was founded very much around Josh's IP. And that came out of Martin Rothman, who many of you know and spoke here the last time we all got together. Very well-known and creative entrepreneurial interventional cardiologist. And he was looking at work you were doing in the coronaries. And he kind of looked at it and said, well, I don't think this coronary stuff is going to work, but I think we can make this work in the lower limb, where some of the challenges and sizing and make it easier, but also where there's a gigantic clinical need.
And that was transvascular, right?
That was transvascular.
Which was acquired or by
we licensed
Medtronic.
92 of your patents, and so that form.
Not 93.
No, but and we don't use ultrasound anymore, which is where. So, but we've kind of evolved. But that formed the basis around which LimFlow was originally incubated by MD Start. I mean, Tim Linehan is over there, who spent years incubating it, and I joined in 2016. But it's an idea that runs counter to kind of page 2 of the anatomy textbook. We know what arteries do and veins do. But here we're trying to use a vein to deliver oxygenated blood, which is which you would think is a real challenge. It is a challenge, but we just finished enrollment in our trial in March, and it works. And the clinical community is convinced now it works. And we hope to submit for FDA approval at the end of the year and in Q4 and have approval next year and commercialize. But we're breakthrough technology, so we fit into a lot of the reimbursement discussions that are going on, whether it be MCIT or NTAP or TPT codes and all this kind of like, how do you get a new innovative technology that is adding a lot of health economic value, a lot of clinical value, and how do you get that and wedge it into this crazy process that's in the U.S. of coverage and payment, right, and coding. Yeah. So we have to spend a lot of time talking about it. Even though we're in a relatively strong position because of the breakthrough designation, it still is a massive concern because, as you say, the FDA is still difficult, and we're a PMA. But at the end of the day, like reimbursement and what do you do next? Once you've fixed one thing, it's always about what do you do next, right? So.
And you hit on a couple of the acronyms that we'll get into in a little bit. Harry, let's talk a little bit about Endotronics. And you guys are in a digital health platform, and we're going to have a digital health panel coming up. Talk a little bit about the different needs, different requirements, different demands that places, from a reimbursement perspective, and also talk about kind of where you are. I know you're focusing on the U.S., but kind of tell us where you are in the process.
Sure. Yeah. So we are a digital health and MedTech play. So that whole intersection, connected devices, and that creates its own challenges. And all of these things with policy, you do something new, the policy framework is not set up for it. and you need to change policy and navigate the system. So some of our challenges have been, we are an implantable device like MedTech. You have the classic FDA, PMA style regulatory pathway, but we implant a diagnostic, so it doesn't deliver a therapeutic benefit by itself. And the therapy benefit comes from how clinicians interact with the digital health side of the system and use that information to change therapy. So it's different clinical trials, different reimbursement pathways, who's the true user of the system. You start crossing all of these policy domains. And for those who aren't aware of the product, it's for chronic heart failure. We implant a sensor in the patient's heart in their pulmonary artery, and then patients take that measurement from home every day, and then clinicians make medication change decisions remotely. So we've kind of navigated some of the reimbursement stuff early. It is top of mind for any investor. How are you going to get this reimbursed? And we are a 10-year behind fast follower, if you think about that. And we do benefit from a lot of the work that strategics have done before us to create the coding framework and move that through, but you're also limited by what's been done before us. So we've had to figure out reimbursement strategies for how clinicians interact with the data, and so they get paid while they use the information to change therapy. And then we also have to figure out how to get the device reimbursed for the implant. And we've got experiences from the breakthrough pathway, so we were not innovative enough to be breakthrough because we are not a first-of-kind device, yet we benefit from a reimbursement framework that existed. So we've run our trial in the U.S. With the Category B designation, and we did that because we had to run a giant trial.
Can you talk a little bit for people who may not be familiar with Category B and what that means?
Category B, so when you submit your IDE, your trial application to the FDA, they either classify you as experimental, so brand new, we don't know if this is going to work, or not experimental. So Category A is experimental. You're not eligible for payment with an experimental product. But if you're Category B, you are eligible to receive payment from Medicare for the procedures that you do, and then hospitals can bill Medicare for a lot of the procedures related to the device. So because the coding framework existed, we were close enough to that. We were doing a trial that Medicare cared about, and they would use the data. They granted us Category B approval. So we're pre-commercial, yet we can charge for the device in the trial. And when you have to run a 1,000-patient trial, you need every dollar you can get. So assuming that Medicare can reimburse, that's potentially $30 million in capital we don't need to raise. So on paper, it sounded like a great idea. Let's have Medicare help fund this trial. And then what we realized getting into it is it was a nightmare. It was a disaster because patient insurance coverage became our number one screening criteria. And we came into this naively from a policy perspective saying, well, patients who have Medicare, we'll charge them. Patients who don't, we won't charge. We'll set up a patient access program and cover it that way. But then hospital compliance departments take a very conservative view of the interpretation, say, we have to treat all patients the same. We can't charge some patients and not the others, which is complete bullshit because they don't treat all the patients the same because if you don't have reimbursement, you don't get it. Right. And Category B, and this is some of the challenges with MCIT, which was Medicare only, what we really saw was it's not just about Medicare. Who's your secondary insurer? And also, Medicare doesn't apply to Medicaid. And now 50% of Medicare Advantage, which are really private plans. So if you don't have these private plans engaged in the process, your insurance policy drives whether you have access to a technology or not. And kind of one more thing, I'll get off my soapbox on this, is the ESG talk yesterday, a lot of stuff around equity and access. I think MedTech really should look at reimbursement as this is truly patient access. This is a policy, this is a patient access policy. And the way it's set up, it just absolutely denies patients access to technology that'll help them. So we've had to deal with that reimbursement puzzle, both operationally and running a clinical trial. And then, of course, every investor is looking at that downstream. And we ultimately decided to walk away from the Category B coverage. We had to recontract all our sites. We said, we're just.
So you changed your trial design?
We changed our trial design twice to make it more advantageous to actually execute it. And reimbursement was just eye-opening how much of a fiasco it is at every center and how much it hurts patients, really.
Yeah. I think the best metaphor is, as you go forward, it's like peeling an onion and you're going to cry. Because it's, you understand at every level more, but it's just like, it's as you say, it's always this incredible, there's always one more layer where you realize there's a different connection between the AMA and how things work and what CMS is doing and what private payers are doing and who's playing follow the leader and who's not. And it's just an amazing...
Well, that's the challenge, I think, and for people, for European companies that are used to, well, granted, you've got a national reimbursement system in each country in Europe, but it's a single body that you're generally dealing with. You're dealing with NICE in the UK. Whereas in the US, you have this hodgepodge of not only CMS, but you've got what are called the MACs, the Medicare Administrative Contractors, on a regional basis. You've got the private insurers. You've got, again, when you're talking about CPT codes, because remember in reimbursement, you're talking about 3 buckets, coding, coverage, and payment. So you've got the AMA focusing on the CPT coding process and the private insurers. So it's really a moving target for, depending on your technology.
It's true, I think, but on the other side of it, in Europe, you get a definitive yes or no.
Right.
And in the US, there is some ability to kind of be somewhat creative and work with different parties and maybe find ways around. I mean, if Enix says, you don't get an NUB, right? There's no more unaccountable, opaque organization I've dealt with than like them. They're just like, oh, no.
Yeah.
And France, I mean, you can work the process. I've successfully appealed a negative French reimbursement decision. So like you can do that. It's heavy, but it's interactive. But I mean, at least in the US, there's some level of like, maybe we could figure this out another way, even if it takes a long time.
And it's interesting now because with MDR, you have companies that previously would be going to Europe first and maybe looking at the reimbursement situation in Europe, now looking at the US first. And so this is, need to be aware of what's going on there. And Harry, you mentioned MCIT, so that's a great segue into the reimbursement report. Before I do that, let me also flag, since we talked about the reports that came out of Biodesign, both on reimbursement and then the regulatory report. There's also another interesting report that came out of UCLA Biodesign that also touches on digital as well. So I just encourage people who may be interested. A similar methodology to what described, but it might be of interest to people.
Thanks for listening so far. This interview will continue after this short message. Market Pathways is the #1 publication that covers the people, challenges, and opportunities impacting the global medical device regulatory, reimbursement, and policy spheres. MyStrategist.com is your digital home to access all of our coverage and read the latest issue of Market Pathways. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.
So let's segue into, so MCIT, Medicare Coverage of Innovative Technology, was a program that has gone through a roller coaster ride, ultimately was repealed. Josh, talk a little bit about what led you to want to do the reimbursement report as kind of the first out of the gate for the policy module, for biodesign and the impact on MCIT. And let me also throw another acronym out there you're going to hear called TCET, TCET, which is the kind of current version of MCIT. It's the best way to explain.
The current name for the undefined future of what MCIT's going to be. So, I mean, we all know, everyone in this room knows, reimbursement is the biggest issue facing all of us, right? So when I started at Biodesign back in August. I came back full time. And I knew, we have a couple of objectives of what we want to do. We've got 3 main new thrusts for where I want to take biodesign in the future. And one of them is this policy area, as I mentioned. I realized that, it'd been a while, it'd been, at least 10 years since we did our paper, and that we need to do something current to show that we can sort of get the ball rolling and get back engaged. And that was the active topic, and it was clear at that point in August of last year that CMS was making all sorts of sounds that they're going to repeal it. They had delayed it after it was supposed to get active earlier in the year in January, and it was looking like it was almost surely destined to be set aside. But it's a really good idea. It was actually conceived of back during the Obama administration. And there are probably many people in the audience here who had a role in that, in advancing that idea. And it sort of languished. It started to take some shape right before the change of administrations. But then when Trump came in, he was like, no new regulations, basically. And so it was either, if you're going to add one, you have to take 2 out or something like that. So clearly MSIT was never going to get anywhere. And so there was no development, no further thinking, no further action behind it. And then for some reason, literally weeks before he left office, he pushed MSIT over to CMS and said, here, do this, and with no definition and no framework that was ever going to be successful. So it was sort of doomed for failure. There was no chance. It would have been impossible to implement. It was a really good idea, and what it is that the basic idea is, as soon as you get approval for a breakthrough product, as breakthrough as defined by the FDA, there's a definition. It's basically things that are life-saving or prevent a life-threatening or a injury of some kind, that there's no good existing alternative. Is basically the idea. So it's not for incremental stuff. It's for big breakthrough ideas, and the proposal is, as soon as those things get approved, they will be covered by CMS for 4 years, during which time, well, actually, MSIT was just, it'll be covered for 4 years, period. That sounds great. Unfortunately, there was no mention of the need to collect any data during that time frame, and there was no framework for what category of different devices and how you handle this thing called reasonable and necessary, which is something that's required in the statutes for CMS to pay for things. So, unfortunately, all those were unaddressed issues and really resulted in the whole thing falling apart and for them stalling it and ultimately taking it off the table. But thankfully, there's enough bipartisan support for it, and that there was an openness and an engagement about, well, what could we replace it with? And that's where this idea of TSET, which is Transitional Coverage for Emerging Technologies, came out. No definition of what that is, but it's sort of, this is our offering to replacement, and community, tell us what you want. And so it seemed like a good opportunity to illustrate why it's important, because there was a lot of debate amongst folks saying we shouldn't be doing anything like this, about why it's important. And so we did a study. We did survey large and small companies, innovators. We surveyed investors, and the findings are pretty powerful. Just to highlight the chief findings, things that you already know. I mean, many of these things, we all know these things, but it's good to actually collect the data and put a fine point on the number. It takes an average of 4.5 years after approval for a breakthrough style technology to actually get widespread coverage in the United States. I'm very sorry to say. Yeah.
It's not part of the plan.
I mean, yeah, that's not in the plan. No, except for lymph flow. Everyone else, No, but 4.5 years is a long time at a high burn rate. It's just, not good. That's going to kill a lot of technology. It's going to send investors away from space, and it's going to hurt patients. It's going to hurt access, So that's the number one thing. The other thing that was very powerful, and we knew from our work with Congress and the White House previously that they really do care about this, which is how do those policies influence investor and innovator decisions about what to work on? And in the survey, we showed that because of the adverse environment around reimbursement, innovators and investors are less likely to work on important life-saving therapies in cancer and in heart disease and in neurological disorders, because if they're that much harder, it's not worth it. And that's a message that really gets home to Congress, and so that will be amplified in further communications. Because
let me interject one irony here, which is we already have a climate where investors are clearly saying we're not as interested in Me Too products. We really want to look at innovative products. And while we've made fixes on the regulatory side, if we don't solve the reimbursement problem, you have the same pressures. So we heard yesterday about the challenges that MDR is placing on innovation in Europe. Again, it should be recognized that one of the challenges with the reimbursement issue is that it does have an impact on the innovative ecosystem.
Right, absolutely.
So Harry, let me ask you, just to raise just another aspect of this, which is the kind of software as service concept. That's something that you and other digital health companies are facing. That's how physicians get paid. So talk about layering that into the reimbursement process, because a different dynamic than let me just say traditional, more traditional medical devices.
Yeah, I think I will say this was our experience with the FDA and as well looking at the payment policies. We did see kind of a tale of two worlds with our product, where we're going on the implant side with MedTech. In FDA's defense, it's high risk. There's risk to the patient, but you have more of a traditional view of FDA on not quite conservative, but more traditional approach. Whereas when we would go talk to them about the software side, it's very innovative. They were doing a lot of new things, enforcement discretion. So you just kind of saw this dichotomy of anything in digital health. People are looking to make changes and make things possible. And we see that on the reimbursement landscape as well, too. It's very slow to change on the device side of the reimbursement. But things like the remote physiologic monitoring had come out, things with telehealth recently. But even before remote physiologic monitoring, there were creation in the U.S. of these chronic care management and complex chronic care management codes and transitional care management codes. So CMS was very aggressive around pushing codes that relate to physician behavior in digital health, not necessarily digital health per se, to just try to drive preventative care and encourage providers to adopt care strategies around preventative care. So they started these reimbursement codes probably 5-6 years ago, and they've continually increased it. And CMS is trying to get providers, incentivize them with the carrot, is do more of this, we're willing to pay for this. And that's led to continued increase in RVUs or CPT levels around complex chronic care management or RPM. They've moved these to time-based. So with us and our technology, it's this blessing and curse is we don't deliver the therapy. Our device doesn't. We rely on clinicians to act on information over time to deliver therapy. And for them to do that, they need to be paid to do that. And really, any device has to be part of keeping the lights on in the hospital, or when things get stressed, they're not going to do it. They got to keep the lights on and treat these patients. So a lot of the coding framework around delivery of care services, we had to focus on that early for investors, to convince investors that no, these physicians do have time. They can be paid. It's a profitable part of care delivery. There's just an education, and it's early in the cycle they need to do. So we had to wrap around strategies for payment for clinicians to use the product on the back end, and how we could deliver the product and price it in there, and the economics could work. So, but I think Medicare has been a driver of that, and then other private payers have adopted and followed suit to allow coverage for some of those physician payment codes. It's less clear in Europe, and I think there's just a lot of challenges with where regulations are moving in Europe, and that whole pendulum is swinging. But in the U.S., it has become the digital health framework and payment around it. It's viable.
Dan, we were talking a little bit about the different components of the U.S. reimbursement system. I want to talk about a couple of, let me just call them generally accepted myths. I think one positive, one negative, that you had some experience. One is this notion that you need a national coverage decision, and that's really the way to go in a positive way. And the other is that Category 3 codes are the kiss of death, and should be avoided at all costs. Talk a little bit about your experience, and maybe just for people again who aren't exactly familiar with NCDs or Category 3s, a little bit about what those are.
So I'm by no means an expert. What I am is I've been through these discussions with multiple advisors, and A versus B, good or bad, charge, no charge, right? And national coverage decision, is it great? Is it not? And I think one of the things that for us, we got feedback, which is that actually the MAC process for us is better. One of the concerns, and this kind of pops up again as you peel this onion, you understand that there's a lot of complexity with all of these processes, and there are a lot of tripwires that you can get yourself caught up in. And almost every NCD that's ever come out, and I got this from a former CMS administrator, has had substantial limitations on the coverage. So they'll say, it's a national coverage decision, great, but we've carved out that this is what you're actually covered for, right? And so, it's great, you've just bypassed the whole MAC process, but MACs generally don't do limitations of coverage. So it's like, great, but you've taken a very binary risk, because if you get a negative NCD, you're in real trouble, right? Potentially permanently, no real appeal process. If you get a positive one, but they carve out 50% of your market, well then, I'm not so happy either. But then if you fight the MACs, it takes time, but eventually they will kind of play follow the leader, and you can get a generic kind of coverage for all of these 9 MACs and 14 regions, is it? I mean,
13 MACs?
13, yes, who knows? So that's one where, again, there is subtlety. The more you dig into it, the more you'll understand. I've heard about private payer coverage and them going back and looking at the exclusion criteria from your study, excluding every patient that was excluded from your study is excluded from coverage. You don't think about that when you're writing your trial. They go back and they read your trial, your publications, and say, look at the limitations that these physicians wrote at the end on the last paragraph, saying, this study is, needs more research. And they're like, aha.
It's experimental.
Aha. And they may choose to reference, as the only piece of literature they reference, your first-in-man study, because they didn't take the time to do a full literature search, right? So there are all these things where you really have to sit there and think, like, how am I playing this game, right? Where are the minefields? Category 1 versus Category 3 versus no code is another one where, obviously you want Category 1, but lots of changes. You sit 3 consultants in a room, they'll give you three different answers, even though there are only 2 choices. And it's incredible how. So ultimately, you've got to make decisions about what you do, right? And you can be Category B and not charge, right? Which is what we did, right? Because we just said, this is going to be an administrative, a legal, a compliance nightmare.
It is.
So we're just not going to do it. It's 100 patients. We're just going to eat the cost and go fast, right? Your board may not be happy with that decision, right? But you have to make calls about like where's the weighting, because a lot of this stuff is just never going to be 100% clear.
Right. Yeah. We're up against time. Josh, let me give you the last word, which is just to give us a feel for what do you think the next steps are with the TSET report? You think it'll track the success you had with the regulatory report in terms of, and I'm not asking you to, I know you don't have a crystal ball, in terms of making progress on the reimbursement front?
We're making progress already. We are engaged with the leaders at CMS. There's an active dialogue, and the community's also, contributed to that. So I'm actually have a fair degree of optimism that we're going to see something that is workable. I don't think it's going to be as easy and as broad and as open as original MSIT, but I think we're going to get something out of it. And I do think it's going to take legislation as well. So there's a I think it's 21st Century Cures or Cures 2.0 or something like that going through Congress. Right. That's going to be necessary to pass because CMS has one person dedicated to this whole thing inside. And there's just no way that one person can administer this whole program for all of us here that want to take advantage of it. So there has to be more resources at CMS to support it. So legislation is going to be necessary, which means all of the, access to for those people who are in the United States here, access to your Congress, folks and representatives, et cetera. It's going to be important to get their support for that bill, which will probably go through in the next couple of months. CMS needs more resources to actually do this for innovation.
Thanks for listening to this latest version of the Market Pathways podcast. We hope you enjoyed this discussion about the MedTech reimbursement process. To hear this podcast again or to listen to other podcasts or learn more about our publications, Market Pathways and MedTech Strategist, along with our conferences, we urge you to go to our website, medtechstrategist.com. Thanks for listening.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. Your support is valuable and makes us better. Please remember to leave a review and rate Market Pathways on Apple Podcasts or wherever you happen to listen.